Welcome to Why Racial Justice is Climate Justice, a workshop presented by the San Diego 350 Jedi team. Please introduce yourself in the chat with your name and any team you're in, and add your pronouns to your Zoom name. You can use my name as an example. Just hit the three little dots and click rename, and you can go ahead and add those pronouns. We want to start this workshop on justice by acknowledging a foundational, horrific injustice. All of us in San Diego County are on land brutally stolen from the Kumeyaay Nation. The Kumeyaay expertly managed this land and environment for more than 10,000 years. Imagine what a better world we would have today if the white immigrants to the Americas had respected and assimilated to Native culture instead of taking over by force. This acknowledgement serves not only to recall this history, but to also identify the ways it plays out in the present. We must interrogate how current policies and the management of this land perpetuate this history. May we take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land and honor their legacy by working to ensure the self-determination of all Native and oppressed peoples. In this workshop, we'll provide further information on environmental racism toward Native tribes and on the strength of the Indigenous people fighting back. This workshop is brought to you on behalf of the San Diego 350 Jedi team. So go ahead and wave or say hi when I introduce you all. These are all the hardworking, or some of the hardworking folks at least, that have been contributing to this project for nearly a year now. Anita Martinez. Danielle Wilkerson, that's me. Jasmine King and Susan Dirks.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. We are also being supported by Jadison Madrigal today, helping us out by sharing her screen and with tech support. So thank you so much for hopping into that role. We would like to take a moment to mention Jasmine's father, David King, who passed away last night. We all send warm thoughts to Jasmine and their family at this sad time. And we thank you for all of the hard work that you put into this presentation to make this a reality, and for still showing up and supporting us in this very difficult time. So here is a look at the agenda and what we'll be covering today. First, an overview of environmental racism and the climate crisis, then some examples of how climate solutions might worsen inequity. Then we'll leave you with some hope and things to think about as we go. Make notes of things you would like to explore further. We cannot cover everything, and we're not claiming to have all the answers. We are here to raise important questions. So yes, please take notes on anything you have questions of during the presentation. This first section will be an overview of environmental racism as it relates to the climate crisis. Please hold questions to the end of this section or type them in the chat. Globally, the people least to blame for the climate crisis are suffering the most. Most of you probably have heard this many times, but you may not realize how stark the difference is. On these maps, the darker shades mean more carbon emissions on the left and higher risk for climate disasters on the right. In general, the Northern Hemisphere emits more and the Southern Hemisphere suffers. Now we have a quick question about the share of CO2 emissions. Does the US emit as much atmospheric carbon as all of South and Central America, or twice as much, or more? Let us know what y'all think in the chat. Again, the question is, does the US emit as much atmospheric carbon as all of South and Central America, or twice as much, or more? I see some answers pop out. A lot of people don't have faith in us. I see a lot of probably mores. Um, I'll give y'all a few more seconds to get those in before we reveal the astounding results. And again, we're just answering in the chat, just your best guess. This one's more on the fun side of things. I don't know if that's a good way to put it. Okay, now we can go ahead and reveal the answer. All of you who guessed more are correct. It's actually almost 6 times as much. The US has 4% of the world's population, but has emitted 25% of global carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution. Only 4.3% has come from all of South and Central America together. This light blue wedge and the green sliver next to that show less than 3% from the entire continent of Africa. Another 26% has come from Europe, and the disparity of blame is actually worse because much of the emissions from places like China has come from making products for the US and other wealthy countries. So good job. I think a lot of you got that one. Globally and within the US, the same communities are hit worst by both ongoing exposure to pollution and the climate chaos it creates. This is the overlap of environmental injustice, the unequal burden of pollution from toxic waste, freeways, power plants, pipelines, and so on, and climate injustice, unequal risk from climate disasters such as heat waves, drought, and floods. We are seeing new examples of this almost every day, right now, including the tragic flooding in Pakistan and the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi. And now I will pass the mic to Susan.
Hi, everybody. A major point that we want to make today is that racism is not just an outcome of the climate crisis. Racism and the wealth gap are core causes of the crisis. Remember this quote from the first slide about wealthy white people living next to coal plants? Well, they wouldn't. If it was their backyard or nothing, we would have developed cleaner energy systems. Hop Hopkins, a Sierra Club director from LA, wrote, "You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people." He went on, "If we valued everyone's lives equally, there wouldn't be a climate crisis. We would find other ways to advance science and create shared wealth without poisoning anyone." Hopkins and others have concluded we will never survive the climate crisis without ending white supremacy. Heather McGhee's 2021 book, The Sum of Us, details how racism leads white people to hurt themselves along with others. Her best known example is all the white towns that drained and closed their swimming pools in the 50s and 60s rather than let black people in. And in the same way, wealthy, powerful white Americans have failed to act on climate because racism and wealth disparity blind them to the impacts. This is why we must fight racism to have a chance against the climate crisis. So in the next few slides, we're going to briefly examine the history, the present, and the future of this problem. Next slide. It's not an accident that people of color live in polluted areas. First, colonialism and slavery established the capitalist industrialized economy, providing resources for the privileged through the exploitation of black labor and indigenous land. Then, redlining in the 1930s worsened segregation and impoverished communities of color. The next slide is going to have more about that. Then, decades of zoning decisions burdened those neighborhoods with industry, waste dumps, freeways, pipelines, power plants, and so on. And this picture shows one outcome of racist policy. I-94 cuts through southeast San Diego with little or no buffer for 2 schools right next to the freeway. So about redlining. Redlining was part of FDR's New Deal in the 1930s. The federal government rated mortgage loan risk of neighborhoods in 200 cities, including 8 in California, and they created what they called residential security maps. The original maps look like the small one on the left, and on the right is a clearer story map created by Cal EPA. And we're going to give you a bunch of resources, including a link to this really amazing interactive map. So look for that. So it's called redlining because they use the color codes you see in the top corner. The criteria for rating an area hazardous, which was red, included if the residents were Black, Indigenous, or other people of color who were called inharmonious racial or nationality groups. People in the red line neighborhoods were denied federally backed mortgages and other credit, which helped whites accumulate wealth. Between 1934 and 62, the US government gave out $120 billion in home loans, and 98% of it went to white people. For decades, cities then used racist housing covenants and zoning decisions to keep the red areas segregated and polluted. Now note on this map that La Jolla is all green and blue, all best and desirable, except for one red square, which was 6 blocks they called the servants' quarters of La Jolla. And also note all the red area concentrated along the intersection of the 94 and 805. So if we go to the next slide, this is a current map of pollution levels in San Diego. The dark red is the most polluted, and notice how it is concentrated along the very same areas along I-94 and 805 that were heavily redlined. And so nationally, redline neighborhoods still are 5 degrees hotter in the summer, some of them up to 13 degrees hotter. They have less green space and more paved surfaces that absorb and radiate heat. A 2019 study of the California cities that were redlined found that residents of redline neighborhoods were twice as likely to visit emergency rooms for asthma, which is a common health impact of pollution. So now we're going to watch a brief clip about asthma from a wonderful documentary called Coming Clean by Green New Deal at UCSD. This features UCSD student Tajuri Brown Newsom.
Specifically, like growing up like Black, you'd be like, some issues will happen and you just be like, damn, life is just like that. Like really using, like I have asthma and I grew up in like the West Islands neighborhood, and like my best friend who lives around the corner from me, he also has asthma. And it's just like, damn, we both have asthma. That's unfortunate. But like I love like come into like learning more about climate change and learning more about the forces, the human forces specifically behind climate change, like pollution from cars, pollution from oil drilling that's done like 3 miles away from my house. You see that like these aren't things that just happen to us because we're human. Like it wasn't random. It's because not enough has been done to tackle climate change. The UC system really has to decarbonize.
Okay, now I'm going to turn the mic over to Anita Martinez.
Okay, environmental racism has many health impacts. Asthma is one of the worst. Black children in the US are 5 times more likely to die of asthma than white children. Here are just a few examples. Black mothers have double the risk of stillbirth and low birth weight babies, which is linked to excess heat and air pollution. Black, Latinx, and Native people all have higher rates of COVID deaths and hospitalization than white people. That's at least partly because of lung and heart conditions caused by air pollution. And US farm workers, who are 75% Latinx migrants, suffer from many environmental health threats, including heat exposure and chemical poisoning of their water, food, and air. The history of racism toward Native Americans has continuing environmental impacts. A study of 380 tribes last year found they live in areas with higher climate risks than their historical lands that were stolen. The tribes were forced on the lands that now have more extreme heat and less rain. Wells are drying up, crops are dying, water is contaminated, and some native villages in Alaska are disappearing into the rising ocean. And it isn't just history. Today, there are many ways racism continues to feed the climate crisis. In recent years, Native tribes constantly have to fight oil and gas pipelines being built through tribal lands. The Dakota Access, the Keystone XL, Mountain Valley Pipeline, and so on. Besides the hazards to air and water quality, the so-called man camps of workers on these projects have caused an epidemic of murdered and missing Indigenous women. Another massive pipeline being built now is the East African crude oil pipeline. Here's a map of its route. The project will displace thousands of families and threaten water resources relied on by 40 million people in Uganda and Tanzania, which is about the same as California's population. But these are people considered disposable. Despite protests, the East African pipeline is going forward with massive financial backing from around the world, including from these banks: Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citibank, and others. We will go ahead and provide links to ongoing efforts to stop this pipeline. One more example of racism continuing to feed the climate crisis is oil drilling, which is still increasing in the US with 60% more active drilling rigs in 2022 than last year. Even in California, which leads on climate action, Governor Newsom has approved over 1,300 oil well permits so far in 2022. He's moved to stop only fracking, which is a small percentage, and not until 2024. He hopes to end all new drilling by 2045. San Diego 350's Youth v. Oil team is working to speed that up. But why is the slow pace acceptable? Could one reason be that most of the 5.5 million Californians living within 1 mile of oil or gas wells exposed to water and air contamination are people of color? Nationally, 18 million people live within 1 mile of active wells, which are mostly clustered in marginalized and low-income communities. So just last night, an important new bill was passed in California. We don't have the details yet, but it aims to cut emissions and adds new restrictions on oil and gas drilling. This is good news, but implementation will be critical. So now looking at the future, inequity will only get worse as the climate crisis gets worse. The latest IPCC report predicts that drought will displace 700 million people in Africa when their land is unlivable. How will rich countries treat them? For perspective on that number, the Ukraine war created about 12 million refugees. Famine will increase worldwide as extreme weather destroys crops. Massive food shortages are expected before 2040, with steep drops in corn, soybeans, and rice production. Extreme heat is the deadliest weather-related disaster. In the US, killer heat waves are worse in predominantly Black and Latinx counties. And flooding will devastate lower income areas of the US, Southeast, that are unprepared for storms, pushing the ocean farther inland. So, as things get worse, wealthier people and nations can afford ways to adapt. They tend to see the climate crisis as survivable. Think about people you may know whose only response to the climate crisis is to buy a generator or fortify their own home. Likewise, when local governments talk about climate adaptations, who and what are they focused on protecting? Here's another reason. Fighting racism must be part of the climate fight. A Yale climate communications study found that people of color in the US were more likely than white people to be alarmed or concerned about the climate crisis. You can see the percentage differences here, but for many people dealing with racism and white supremacy has to be their first priority. Of course, there are many people of color leading climate solutions, but they're constantly battered by another existential crisis and the stress of daily racism. So here are words of two leading climate scientists So would someone like to read the first quote for us? You can go in your reactions on the bottom of the screen and just click raise hand. And we will call on you if you want to do that. I think our tech support or someone. Okay, Zoe, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. How can people of color effectively lead their communities on climate solutions when faced with pervasive and life-shortening racism? Even at its most benign, racism is incredibly time-consuming.
Thank you, Zoe. And the next quote, can we get someone else to raise their hand? Anyone else want to read a quote? Joyce Lang, go ahead.
There's no way that I can be thinking about my grandkids 100 years from now and not be thinking about my kids being stopped by the police next week.
Thanks, Joyce. So we all must join them in fighting racism and white supremacy. To have the consensus and force that we need to fight the climate crisis, we must heed these words from author Toni Morrison, who wrote, "The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. Racism is the enemy of everything we're trying to do in the climate movement." So now we'll take some time for questions on anything that we've covered so far. I don't know if there's any questions in the chat.
Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand so we can unmute you, pop them in the chat. But yeah, Scott.
Hey there. It took a while to unmute, I apologize. So one of the other things that racism deals with and we don't talk a lot about is the material reality of people's circumstances, because racism is long-term and has made people so, has made so much poverty that you're spending all of your, I think this is what I understand, is that people are also spending a lot of their time just trying to live. Could you comment on that?
I can say something about that. I think that this workshop is really focusing on racism, but it's so intersectional with economic injustice. And we've tried to bring that in a few places, but there, you know, that we could have a whole another workshop. But yes, that's definitely, you know, a big factor and goes hand in hand. Yeah, I see Debbie.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on to that, Susan, that's a big reason that I'm sure like that we haven't solved racism, right? Like it's beneficial for some to keep folks distracted, right? To keep them worried about how they're going to have a roof over their head, where the next meal is going to come from, and specifically with SDG&E's absorbent rates, like whether they're going to be able to pay their utility bill or their grocery bill, right? And how when you have all of that constant stress and you're constantly in survival mode, how do you think long term about the existence of the entire planet? And you're like that quote said, I can't think about my great grandchildren when I have to think about myself and my own kids. Yeah, Debbie.
Debbie, you're muted. I can't hear you.
I think Debbie wants to ask, want to understand what we can do.
Oh, is that your question, Debbie? So we are going to...
Wait 1 second. Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I do.
Okay, sorry, it was my speaker. So yeah, I'm trying to understand. Like I said, it's upsetting. I think you didn't hear that. It's upsetting and, you know, enlightening as well. So I'm trying to understand what we can do and this is what we can do. It's got to be something we can do as a group and try to help.
That is an excellent question, and that's one of the main reasons we're doing this workshop. We're not done right now. We're going to say some things about that later today.
Okay.
But we're also going to have a second session where we're really going to focus on that and try to work with SD350 teams specifically on how their work in their teams can.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Were there any other questions before we move into our first set of breakout rooms and discussion? Okay, that doesn't look like there are any. So we are going to go into breakout rooms, which will open in just a moment, and we are going to answer a few questions, which are on the next slide. And yeah, your facilitator will provide more instructions. Good to see you all back in here. I hope you got to introduce yourselves to one another and had some good conversation.
Next slide, please. Okay, so I think we are actually on track to finish. We're going to be done by 7:30, so thank you all. But now we're going to talk for a few minutes about the need to make sure that climate action itself is equitable. The next slide. I'm going to be giving you some examples of how climate solutions could cause inequity. And to be clear, the shift to sustainable energy is essential and will reduce racial and economic disparities by reducing pollution and climate disasters. But all climate solutions have some negative effects. So windmills kill birds and solar farms destroy some habitat. Hydropower requires damming rivers. That doesn't mean we don't need those things. But in our urgency to act, we need to be careful to avoid creating new racial and economic inequity. So here are just a few examples. I'm sure there are many more. Our first big example is offsets and other greenwashing that lets companies keep extracting and polluting. So let's watch a short backgrounder on this. Oh, we need sound. Can we start it over? Sorry. We're going to start that again with the sound because you wouldn't want to miss it.
Welcome to Climate Town. I'm Raleigh Williams, alarmingly pale, needlessly shirtless, and a climate science grad student. And I'm here to tell you that carbon offsets won't save us. And big corporations know that. Okay, carbon offsets are actually pretty simple to understand. Let's say you're a company like BP. Okay, so you're responsible for putting 415 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every single year. It's like if every person, car, and truck in America all crammed together that much weight of CO2 into the atmosphere every single year. That actually seems like maybe an exaggeration. Who's reporting that? Oh, it's their own website? Okay, I just want to make sure because that just sounds irresponsibly high. But no matter, they've pledged to go carbon neutral. So what does that mean? Well, they can either just emit less, or if they can't emit less, or just don't want to, they can emit all 415 million tons of CO2 like normal, and then find another company who is gonna emit that much, and then pay them not to. And that's what a carbon offset is. Offsets come in all different forms, from paying someone in Brazil not to chop down their forest, to catching the gas emissions off of a landfill, to investing in a solar farm in India. All you gotta do is find a certified carbon market and then buy offsets until the amount you've bought matches the amount you've emitted. And then you just freaking crack open a cold one with the boys because you've just solved climate change without ever having to change your behavior even a little bit.
Okay.
Welcome to Climate.
Whoop, there we go. So the offset market is a math trick that lets a company or a city or a university claim a net of zero emissions while they continue or increase their pollution of areas that they consider disposable. And what Raleigh in that video didn't say is that certified offsets often are bogus, as in this cartoon from the UCSD Green New Deal film of a man being paid over and over not to burn his oil tank. So many offsets are useless scams like that. Oh, you're getting ahead of me on the clicks. That the offset market has actually increased net emissions, a study found last year. Real examples reported by John Oliver include funding wind farms that were going to be built anyway and paying a New Jersey billionaire not to cut down the trees on his hunting club. And those were considered certified offsets that allowed a company to keep polluting somewhere else. And some offset projects worsen environmental racism, like a carbon credit program for planting a pine forest that displaced thousands of Ugandan farmers. So besides, even when a company funds an offset that does do some good, why should that let them keep extracting and polluting in impacted communities? Next slide. Resource mining is another big issue. The urgent need for electric vehicles and storage of renewable energy is greatly increasing the demand for minerals essential for batteries like lithium, nickel, cobalt, and copper. Worldwide, we all know mining has a terrible history of exploiting workers and nations who don't share in the benefits. And this is a picture of a copper mine in the Congo. As British Member of Parliament David Lammy says, the exploitation of natural resources has always been tied to the exploitation of people of color. China has dominated lithium production, and there's now a push for more U.S. mining, but much of the U.S. supply is near native lands, and some tribes object to the risk of cultural disruption and water contamination. The Salton Sea, 100 miles east of San Diego, is a major focus of what some are calling a white gold rush. Companies are now competing to develop technology to extract lithium from the underground brine that is used to make geothermal energy. And there are now 11 geothermal plants at the Salton Sea. And here's a picture of one of them. And more are being built in hopes that they can produce vast amounts of lithium along with carbon-free energy. If that works, which isn't for sure yet, the California Energy Commission estimates the Salton Sea area could supply 40% of the world's lithium demand. The towns around the toxic lake, the Salton Sea, are generally impoverished and almost 90% people of color. So how the coming lithium boom is going to affect them is not clear, although the companies are, of course, promising jobs and prosperity. Here is another risk, gentrification. When we improve transit, green spaces, and energy infrastructure, which of course we have to do, will that raise housing prices and push people out? For example, San Diego's proposed Purple Line commuter rail would run from Chula Vista through National City, Southeast San Diego, and City Heights, not quite like this map, to Mission Valley and Kearny Mesa. So this would help a lot of working people, but how do we ensure that this new convenience doesn't jack up their rents? Across the country, cities are tackling the same problem when they create new green spaces in neighborhoods that desperately need them, but then become more desirable. Some are trying solutions like building more affordable housing along with new parks. So we don't know the answer on this, but housing advocates and community residents must be included in planning transit parks and other improvements. So another example, bans or fees on carbon emissions can create economic hardship for the people least able to adapt. Gas-powered leaf blowers, for instance, are health hazards for workers who use them and the planet. They emit as much in 1 hour as if you drove a gas-guzzling mid-sized car from Los Angeles to Denver. 1 hour. California has a new law now banning gas leaf blowers as of January 2024, but that could hurt small landscape businesses and independent gardeners who can't afford new equipment. There's a group called San Diegans for Sustainable, Equitable, and Quiet Equipment in Landscaping, SD-Sequel, and they advocated for a voucher program that will start this fall that will help pay for electric blowers on a first-come, first-served basis. This is one example that even the best intentioned policies can cause unintended harm to low-income working people. In general, we need to keep thinking about who is priced out of the new technology. How can we make rooftop solar available to renters and those who can't afford the installation cost? As long as building electrification is focused on new construction, the health risks of methane gas will continue for people in older housing. And even with the new federal tax credits, not everyone can afford electric cars, and renters will have less access to charging stations. Final example, jobs. We hear a lot about a just transition for fossil fuel workers, but is it happening equitably? There was a study last year by a coalition of 6 energy-related organizations that found that so far this transition is leaving women and people of color behind. Women are about half the US workforce but have less than a third of clean energy jobs so far. Black workers have only 8% of those jobs, although they are 13% of the workforce. And the report found that Latinx workers are mostly in entry-level positions. Of course, the oil and gas industry is even worse at diversity, but their jobs tend to be highly paid with good benefits because they have unions. Unionization of clean energy jobs is needed to ensure good pay and worksite safety. There's a consortium called California Labor for Climate Jobs working on that. So now we're going to watch a short clip again from the UCSD film Coming Clean featuring Anna Medel, a climate activist who grew up in Bakersfield. I think it's on the next slide. Yeah.
Economically speaking, Bakersfield is very reliant on the oil and gas industry. And so that kind of reliance that we have as a county really impacts people's perceptions of climate change and what that means for individuals. And so even within my family, I have siblings and people and cousins, that work within these industries, that work within the oil and gas industry, because that's how you make money. That's how you survive. That's how you live. A lot of people bring out this term of a just transition, but I think some people kind of overlook what that actually means. And so to me, that means being able to provide jobs and good wages to the people that are currently working within oil and gas industry positions, especially those that are directly harming them and their health, and providing jobs within clean energy industries.
How are you?
So do we have any questions on this part so far? We're almost done. If you want to ask a question, put your virtual hand up. Yes, Albie. Can we unmute Albie? Wait a second. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, it's not so much a question as a statement. It just listening to all of that, it involves willingness, it involves good-heartedness, wanting to help people, not wanting to make another dollar. That seems like such an obstacle to the changes that need to be made. It's frightening.
I can't disagree with that.
Yeah.
But I'm going to give you some hope in a minute.
Oh, good.
Anybody else? So, just a second. We do want to leave you with some hope and a peek at our next session. So the good news is there are people working on all the issues we've discussed, and some people are finding solutions. In our second session, which will be later this year, we're going to go deeper into that and also into what's being done in the San Diego area. So we haven't got a date for this yet, but please stay tuned and join us. In the meantime, here are some strategies and things to keep in mind for climate justice work. Center the rights of vulnerable communities. Hold corporations accountable and promote economic fairness. Work for reparations for those who have been harmed. Build coalitions and prioritize inclusive decision-making and self-determination. And in the resource list we're going to give you, we're going to include a longer list of environmental justice principles from the International People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. Just a little bit right now on the next slide. Around the world, there are examples of people finding innovative solutions. Here are just a few. The government of New Zealand has recently started a clean car upgrade program and is empowering the Maori as climate strategy leaders. In Canada, a group of Indigenous women, the Tiny House Warriors, are building 10 tiny houses to block the Trans Mountain Pipeline and getting arrested for it. Boston Mayor Michelle Wu started a free public transit experiment this year by making 3 major bus lines through Black neighborhoods free. The California Public Utilities Commission has a program of incentives and credits to put solar panels on affordable housing complexes. And in San Diego, a grassroots Black-led program called I Am Green has made 3 electric cars available to residents of polluted areas to borrow for free and try them out for a day. These shows you some of the range of ideas that people are coming up with and trying. And on the next slide, also, there are many anti-racism projects in the San Diego area. We encourage you to get involved as an ally, a donor, or however you can. So here are just a few of the many examples. The Community Budget Alliance advocates for racial and economic justice in the City of San Diego budget every year. It's a collaborative program of the nonprofit Center on Policy Initiatives and other organizations, including SD 350. And CPI last year established the San Diego Black Worker Center, offering programs and workshops on Black experiences in the workplace and support for Black workers. Alliance San Diego mobilizes voters, supports immigrants, and advocates policies to build an inclusive democracy. Project New Village is a community hub in southeastern San Diego, improving fresh food access with cooperative gardens and community engagement. The Coalition for Police Accountability and Transparency is advocating for an ordinance called PROTECT, standing for Preventing Over-Policing Through Equitable Community Treatment, to limit discretionary stops and searches by San Diego police, which have overwhelmingly targeted Black and brown people. So as I said, these are just some of the many places you can get involved locally in fighting racism, and we strongly encourage you to pick one, donate, go work in the community garden, do whatever you can. Thank you.
Okay, now we are going to get into our last breakout rooms for a discussion. A discussion on these topics, and it'll be a similar format to last time. Hi, y'all, welcome back. I hope you had some great conversations and some time to reflect on how you would like to bring this back to your teams, to your family, to your community, all of that. So you made it to the end. That was the entire workshop. But while we have you here, this is one of the most critical portions of the workshop. We would really appreciate your feedback. So right now, before anyone logs off, I'm going to put a link in the chat. It's a very short survey, like 4 or 5 questions. We would love your feedback on the presentation, also what you would like to hear covered in the future. Like we mentioned, we're going to be doing another workshop, so we definitely want to include your interests and what would engage you. But most importantly, I would say on this survey is the follow-up portion. We don't want this to be a one and done conversation. We want to have this conversation, have future conversations, and also help sculpt the work that SD 350 does in the future. We want to be able to answer questions about equity. We want to be able to work on that in tandem so that people can really take all the valuable things you learn. So I think we heard a lot of great feedback about that and incorporate it. So please take a moment to fill out that survey for us.